as we heard this morning's readings from Exodus. And it's not from the lectionary lessons for today. I've kind of gone off the script because for Black History Month, I'd like to talk about an exception, a famous prophetic American who visited Mount Vernon twice in the 1930s. Now, one of the reasons I selected the Exodus lesson is because that American hero's first name is Marian, which is a French version of Hebrew name Miriam, the famous hero, prophet, and leader of God's people in our Bible story. Prophets proclaim and lead God's behalf. Another reason is the American prophet who visited Mount Vernon was Marian Anderson, an internationally acclaimed and famous singer. The biblical prophet Miriam was also a singer of international acclamation and fame. These two prophets, unlike most prophets, sang much of their proclamations for God. The primary reason I selected the Exodus text, though, is because both Marian Anderson and Miriam are famous for prophetically leading and singing in the midst of racial and ethnic oppression. Both had to leave their homes to experience freedom and equality, and both helped nations move forward toward the just world God envisions for all. And I want to take just a moment to thank Kenyon Professor Rick Sheffield for helping me discover Marian Anderson's local visits and for graciously sharing unpublished materials on her visits. His work inspired me to give this sermon. Miriam was a biblical-era prophet and leader in the Hebrews movement to end the crushing injustices of Pharaoh's Egypt. Marian Anderson was an early civil rights leader and modern prophet in the 20th century movement to end the crushing injustices of America's racism. Most of us know the biblical Miriam heroically watched over the infant Moses set afloat in a basket to avoid death because Egyptians racistly considered Hebrews as less than. That racism led to oppression, enslavement, and horrifying violence, including the killing of infants, which is why baby Moses was set afloat. Bible story this morning takes place later when Miriam was a part of the freedom movement that the adult Moses led. By then, Miriam was considered a prophet. So well thought of she was tasked with leading the worshipful singing and dancing after the Hebrews escaped the racist slavery and oppression in Egypt, crossing through the Red Sea. Some 3,400 years after Miriam's famous song, Marian Anderson was born. Actually, she was born 124 years ago yesterday. Happy birthday, Marian Anderson. She grew up a century ago in Philadelphia, at a time when Jim Crow allowed Americans with white skin to lawfully discriminate against Americans with black skin. Young Marian grew up poor. Black Americans were limited by Jim Crow to, among other things, jobs they could have, places they could live, parks and entertainment they could experience, medical care they could obtain, bathrooms and drinking fountains they could use, and education Black American children could access. Tragically and unjustly, many shades of that discrimination continues. Marian started singing at a very young age, winning her first award at 8. By the time she was a young teenager, she sang in a number of choirs and took singing gigs to make more money for the family. In those days, racism also included whites ridiculously insisting blacks were only suited to perform simpler music like those sung by whites in black-faced minstrel shows that mocked and demeaned Black Americans. Marian dreamed beyond those absurd stereotypes. She wanted to perform classical music. And racism denied her access to a musical school, but a famous classical vocal teacher, Giuseppe Bogatti, heard her sing and was so moved to Booker T. Washington Club, which led the effort to sponsor Marian Anderson's first concert here. And I'm happy to report that members of our church helped sponsor that concert too. At that time, the Ku Klux Klan thrived in this town. Jim Crow thrived here too, as did demeaning blackface minstrel shows. So it's no surprise Marian Anderson's first concert in Mount Vernon was sadly marred by racism. Hotels would not accommodate her, so she stayed with a local black family. The paper that reported her coming to town also reported on the same page praise for a local minstrel show performed the day before. Just 24 hours before Marian Anderson stood on the Memorial Theater stage, whites donning blackface mocked and denigrated blacks with a lowbrow show, perpetrated the awful racist fictions that black Americans were gross, unsophisticated simpletons without class. And those terrible fictions were defied and utterly blown away the next day by Marian Anderson's classical concert as a beautiful 23-year-old sang sophisticated music in multiple languages in what was very likely the classiest concert the Memorial Theater had held that day, and perhaps only ever exceeded in class by her second concert in 1939. While only modestly attended, and despite other aspects of Jim Crow's presence here, Marian Anderson's first performance at the Memorial in 1930 was critically acclaimed. Tragically, Marian Anderson's experience of racism here is not at all unique. Jim Crow raised its ugly, oppressive head throughout the American tours that she had in the early 1930s. She encountered segregated trains, hotels and restaurants, and her concerts did not regularly sell out. And so she went to Europe, where Jim Crow did not thrive. And in Europe, she became a superstar, singing to full houses time and time again. Why? Because as Maestro Arturio Toscanini gushed, her voice is such as one hears once in 100 years. Across Europe, Marian Anderson singing and her person were respected. And when she returned to America in 1935, she received high praise finally for her singing, and her concerts began to regularly sell out, but she continued to suffer low regard for her person. She continued to be unjustly denied accommodations in hotels and restaurants, and for all her international fame, racism even denied her places to sing. In 1939, Howard University invited her to Washington, D.C., but the Daughters of the American Revolution in that town would not let her sing at the capital's foremost concert hall, Constitution Hall. On the other end of the spectrum, she was also even denied access to a high school stage in D.C. These racist acts caused First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to resign from the DAR, and it led her and the President, the Secretary of the Interior, the NAACP, and many, many others to work with Howard University and Marian and her manager to defy segregation in D.C. and give Jim Crow a resounding what for. They put together an outdoor Easter morning concert at the Lincoln Memorial that was intentionally integrated and an astonishing 75,000 whites and blacks came and joined in side by side to celebrate her singing and to stand in solidarity against racism. It was such an inspiring and astonishing success that it made Marian Anderson an early icon of civil rights. She not only busted down the barrier to classical singing, but led the first ever integrated concert with the largest gathering to that date at the Lincoln Memorial. And Ms. Anderson went on to sing at President Eisenhower and President Kennedy's inauguration, to sing for kings and queens and prime ministers, to become a United Nations delegate and goodwill ambassador, and receive numerous accolades and awards, including medals from President Johnson and President Reagan. But before all of that, just a month after the Easter concert at the Lincoln Memorial, remarkably, Marian Anderson performed again at our Memorial Theater. That time the theater was packed to overflowing. More than 1,200 people fit in there. And the paper reported the concert was a huge success with 3 encores and many, many ovations. Sadly, Marian Anderson was likely still denied local hotel accommodations. But inroads were made on racism, because by then no one questioned the ability of a black person to take on classical music. How could they? The greatest classical singer in the world was an American black woman who had braved racism for 4 decades and proved racism wrong on the world stage and on our own stage twice. Marian Anderson had to leave her home to experience freedom and equality, but she came back. She came back and she helped our nation move forward toward the just world God envisions for us all. Her singing and her actions prophetically proclaimed God's word to America, to Ohio, to Knox County. May America, Ohio, and all of us continue the anti-racism work Mary Anderson was a part of, and that many others have bravely been a part of since. Let us follow her and them, and continue the work of breaking down barriers to